Disabled adult children are currently living in cars and shelters across the country because the Social Security Administration has effectively hidden their legal entitlement to benefits behind a wall of bureaucratic silence. It's a systemic failure that turns a hard-won legal right into a decades-long ghost hunt for families who are often already at their breaking point. When we talk about social safety nets, we usually imagine a system that catches people when they fall. But for thousands of disabled adults, the system isn't a net. It's a labyrinth where the exit is intentionally obscured. We're looking at a specific, documented pattern where the Social Security Administration, or SSA, fails to transition eligible individuals into the Disabled Adult Child, or DAC, benefit program, often leaving them in deep poverty despite federal court orders and clear statutory mandates. This isn't just about paperwork getting lost in the mail. It's about a fundamental breakdown in how our government treats its most vulnerable citizens once they age out of childhood programs. According to recent reports from legal advocacy groups like the Legal Aid Justice Center, the scale of this issue is staggering, with families reporting that they've waited years, sometimes decades, for benefits they were legally entitled to the moment a parent retired or became disabled. Throughout this discussion, we're going to break down how this happens, the legal protections that are being bypassed, and what can actually be done to force a response from an agency that often feels untouchable. The goal here is to shine a light on the specific procedural failures, like the missing age 18 redeterminations and the blatant disregard for medical evidence, that keep disabled adults trapped in a cycle of housing instability and food insecurity. Part 1. The Architecture of Failure. To understand how a person can be hidden from their own benefits, we have to look at the transition from childhood to adulthood within the Social Security system. When a child with a disability is under 18, they might receive Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, which is a needs-based program. But there's another, often much larger benefit available called Disabled Adult Child Benefits, or DAC. The rule is simple. If you became disabled before age 22 and one of your parents starts collecting Social Security retirement or disability benefits, or if that parent passes away, you are eligible for DAC benefits based on their work record. We're talking about a payment that is typically 50% of the parent's benefit while they're alive and up to 75% if they've passed away. For many, this is the difference between a life of extreme poverty and a life of modest stability. But here's where the system breaks. Federal law requires the SSA to perform what's called an age 18 redetermination. It's supposed to be a standard bridge where the agency evaluates the young adult under adult disability criteria. In theory, this is when the SSA should identify DAC eligibility. In practice, however, the SSA frequently fails to initiate these reviews or provide families with any roadmap for the transition. Data from the National Bureau of Economic Research suggests that as many as 60% of parents are completely unaware that this adult eligibility review even exists. They assume the benefits will just continue, and the SSA doesn't exactly go out of its way to correct that assumption. Instead of a proactive transition, families encounter what legal experts call a black hole. Applications are submitted and then simply vanish. There are documented cases where the SSA issued a denial within just a few days of receiving a complex medical file, suggesting that nobody actually looked at the evidence. It's a culture of how can we deny this rather than how can we process this, often driven by the fact that the agency is currently operating with its lowest staffing levels in 25 years, while the number of beneficiaries has climbed by over 20% in the last decade. This underfunding creates a backlog where the average wait for an initial decision has hit an all-time high of nearly 200 days, but for DAC claims, which require tracing disability back to before age 22, the delays can stretch into years. This isn't just a slow office. It's a procedural wall that effectively denies benefits by making the process too long and too confusing to survive. Part 2. Legal violations and the anti-alienation law. When these delays happen, the SSA isn't just being inefficient. It's often violating federal law and its own internal regulations. One of the most significant legal protections for Social Security recipients is the anti-alienation provision, found in Section 407 of the Social Security Act. This law is supposed to be a fortress. It states that Social Security benefits cannot be subject to execution, levy, attachment, or other legal process. The intent is to ensure that this money, which is for basic survival, stays in the hands of the beneficiary. Yet, advocates have found that the SSA uses informal bureaucratic tactics to effectively alienate these funds from the people who own them. By delaying the processing of court orders or losing applications, the agency is essentially withholding funds that a federal judge has already ruled belong to the disabled individual. There's a particularly harrowing trend involving federal court remands. When a claimant is denied, they can eventually sue the SSA in federal court, and the data shows that federal judges are finding errors in about 6 out of every 10 cases they review. Judges have expressed open frustration, calling some SSA decisions essentially unreviewable because the agency ignored key physician records or made blatant factual mistakes. But here's the kicker. Even after a federal judge orders the SSA to pay, the agency can take months or even years to actually cut the check. During that time, the disabled adult has no income. They can't prove their income to a landlord, so they lose their housing. They can't pay for medications, so their health declines. In the eyes of the law, the money is theirs, but in the eyes of the bureaucracy, the file is still pending. This creates a paradox where someone can be legally entitled to benefits and yet remain homeless because of an administrative refusal to comply with a court order. It's a direct violation of the spirit and often the letter of the laws designed to protect disabled Americans from precisely this kind of government overreach. Part 3. The human cost of bureaucratic silence. The impact of these systemic failures isn't just a line on a budget sheet, it's a devastating reality for families. Imagine a mother in her 70s who has spent her entire life caring for an adult son with a profound developmental disability. When she retires and starts her Social Security, her son should immediately start receiving DAC benefits. If the SSA does its job, the family's income increases, providing a safety net for when the mother eventually passes away. But if the SSA fails to notify them, or if the application gets stuck in a desk for 5 years, that son is left with nothing but his own meager SSI, or perhaps no income at all if his SSI was cut off at age 18 during a botched redetermination. This leads to what social workers describe as a survival crisis. Without that DAC income, which is often twice the amount of a standard SSI payment, these individuals fall below the federal poverty line. We see cases where food insecurity leads to emergency room visits, and where the lack of income verification makes it impossible to access subsidized housing. There's also a cultural impact here, a profound loss of trust in the institutions meant to serve the public. When a family spends a decade fighting for a benefit that is clearly outlined in the Social Security Handbook, the emotional toll is immense. They feel hunted by the very agency that is supposed to be their partner. This isn't an accidental oversight, it's a pattern of neglect that targets a population least able to fight back.
Disabled adult children often have cognitive or mental health challenges that make navigating a 200-page application and a multi-year appeals process almost impossible without high-level legal aid. By making the process so arduous, the system effectively screens out those who need it most, leaving them to drift into the margins of society where they are often forgotten until they end up in the criminal justice system or a homeless shelter.
Part 4. Navigating the path to recapture. So what can be done when the system refuses to move? The remedies exist, but they require a level of persistence that is frankly exhausting. The standard appeals process starts with reconsideration, moves to a hearing before an administrative law judge, then to the appeals council, and finally to federal district court. If you're stuck in this cycle, the most important tool is documentation, specifically proving that the disability onset occurred before age 22. This often means tracking down school records, childhood medical files, and early diagnostic reports, which can be difficult if you're now 40 or 50 years old. But that evidence is the only thing that can break the SSA's denial loop. Beyond the standard appeals, there's the option of a congressional inquiry. Reaching out to a senator or representative's office can sometimes act as a jolt to the system. Senator staffers have direct lines to SSA liaison offices, and while they can't force an approval, they can often force a file to be located and processed. For those whose court orders are being ignored, a civil complaint in federal court to enforce the judgment is sometimes the only way to get the agency to pay. This is a battle of attrition. Success requires a combination of aggressive legal representation and a paper trail that the agency can't ignore. We have to recognize that this is a systemic injustice that won't be fixed by one-off approvals. It requires a fundamental change in how the SSA manages the transition of disabled children into adulthood. Until then, awareness and advocacy are the primary tools for ensuring that these hidden beneficiaries are finally seen. If you know someone who might be struggling with this exact situation, share this with them so they know they aren't alone in this fight.